At 11:32 in the morning on December 20th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown tightened his grip on the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress as the sky over Bremen, Germany, erupted in black explosions. Below him, 250 German anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the bomber formation. Brown was 21 years old. He had completed 0 combat missions. This was his first. The German gunners waiting beneath the American bombers were not ordinary soldiers. They were officer candidate school trainees, some of the most highly trained marksmen in the Luftwaffe. They had been waiting all morning. And now the sky above Bremen was filled with American aircraft. Brown's bomber was called Olde Pub. Like every B-17, it carried 10 crewmen and thousands of pounds of bombs. Their target that morning was a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter factory on the outskirts of the city. Destroying that factory meant fewer German fighters attacking Allied bombers over Europe. But the men in the aircraft had been warned during the morning briefing. They would face heavy resistance. Hundreds of German fighters. Massive anti-aircraft defenses. What the intelligence officers did not mention was the position Charlie Brown's bomber had been assigned in the formation. Among the crews of the 379th Bombardment Group, the position had a grim nickname: Purple Heart Corner. It was the outer edge of the formation, the place where enemy fighters always attacked first. Because from that angle, the defensive guns of neighboring bombers could not provide full protection. The aircraft assigned there were exposed, and the newest crews were often placed there. Charlie Brown's crew was the newest of them all. The bombers approached Bremen at 27,000 feet. Temperatures outside the aircraft had dropped to nearly 60 degrees below zero. Inside the cockpit, Brown kept his eyes on the instruments and the formation ahead. Everything depended on staying in formation. Break formation, and the bombers became easy targets. Then the sky exploded. A 20mm cannon shell burst directly in front of the cockpit. The plexiglass nose shattered instantly. The freezing air outside rushed into the aircraft at over 150 miles per hour. The cockpit filled with wind, ice, and the roar of rushing air. The number 2 engine died immediately. The number 4 engine began overspeeding, threatening to tear itself apart. Brown had no choice but to throttle it back. The bomber slowed. Within seconds, the formation began pulling away. And suddenly, Olde Pub was alone. German fighters saw the crippled bomber instantly. Within moments, 12 to 15 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove toward it. The attack was relentless. Wave after wave of fighters tore into the bomber with cannon fire. The number 3 engine was hit and dropped to half power. The oxygen system ruptured. Hydraulic lines burst. The electrical system failed. The tail section was shredded by cannon shells. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, took a direct hit from a 20mm shell. He was killed instantly. Across the aircraft, most of the remaining crew were wounded. Charlie Brown himself felt a sharp burning pain as a bullet fragment struck his right shoulder. Blood soaked into his flight jacket. The cold created another deadly problem. At those temperatures, the oil inside the bomber's machine guns began to freeze. Of the 11 defensive guns mounted on the B-17, only 3 remained operational. The bomber was barely able to defend itself. Then the oxygen system failed completely. At 27,000 feet, a human brain cannot survive without oxygen. Charlie Brown felt the first signs immediately. His vision narrowed. His hands went numb on the controls. Beside him, his co-pilot Spencer Luke slumped forward. Unconscious. One by one, the crew began losing consciousness. Brown fought to stay awake, but the darkness crept closer. His last thought before everything went black was simple. His crew was about to die. On their very first mission. With its pilot unconscious, Olde Pub began to fall. The bomber dropped out of the sky in an uncontrolled dive. The airspeed passed 300 miles per hour. The aircraft shook violently. At any moment, the wings could tear away under the stress. Then something happened that defied logic. At about 1,000 feet above the ground, Charlie Brown regained consciousness. The thicker air at low altitude contained enough oxygen to revive him. His eyes snapped open. The ground was rushing toward them. Brown grabbed the controls and pulled back with everything he had left. The B-17 groaned in protest. For a moment, it seemed the aircraft might break apart. Then the bomber leveled out just above the treetops of northern Germany. Brown looked around the cockpit. Blood everywhere. Injured men everywhere. His tail gunner was dead. His bomber was barely holding together. And he had just flown directly over a German fighter airfield. On that airfield, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had already shot down 2 American bombers that morning. One more victory would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military decorations. He looked up and saw ye Olde Pub limping across the sky barely 100 feet above the ground. Within minutes, Stigler was airborne. His fighter climbed quickly and closed the distance. He positioned himself behind the crippled bomber. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. One squeeze. That was all it would take. The Knight's Cross would be his. But when Franz Stigler looked through his gun sight, what he saw inside the shattered bomber would change everything he believed about war. Charlie Brown stared at the German fighter beside him. The pilot was raising his hand and pointing toward the ground. Brown's heart raced. To him, the meaning seemed obvious. The German was ordering him to land and surrender. Brown shook his head. He would not land in Germany. Not while his crew was still alive. Franz Stigler tried again. This time he pointed north, towards Sweden, neutral territory. If the Americans could reach Sweden, they would be interned for the rest of the war, but they would survive. Doctors would treat the wounded. No one else would shoot them down. But Charlie Brown still did not understand. He kept flying west toward England. 250 miles of freezing ocean separated them from safety, and the bomber was barely holding together. Franz Stigler realized he had only one choice left, a choice that could cost him his life. He made the most dangerous decision of his career. He would escort the American bomber to safety. In Nazi Germany, allowing an enemy aircraft to escape could be considered treason. A fighter pilot who deliberately spared the enemy could face court-martial. The punishment was simple: execution by firing squad. No appeal. No mercy. Stigler understood the risk perfectly. He did it anyway. He maneuvered his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into close formation beside the bomber's left wing. The distance between the 2 aircraft shrank to only a few feet. From the ground, their silhouettes would almost merge into one shape. This was his plan. If German anti-aircraft crews saw a German fighter escorting the bomber, they might assume the B-17 was one of the captured American aircraft the Luftwaffe sometimes used for training, and they might hold their fire. Inside ye Olde Pub, Charlie Brown watched the German fighter move into position beside them. His pulse hammered in his ears. He ordered his top turret gunner, Bernd Kullon, to keep the German in his sights, but not to fire. Brown still had no idea what the German pilot was doing. Was he calling reinforcements? Was this a trick? Or was he simply waiting for the bomber to crash? Minute after minute passed. The German fighter stayed beside them. They crossed farmland, villages, roads packed with German military vehicles. At any moment someone could look up and see them. At any moment flak batteries could open fire. At any moment another German fighter could arrive and question why Franz Stigler was flying beside an American bomber instead of destroying it. But the sky remained quiet. The Germans stayed beside them. And slowly, the coastline appeared ahead. The North Sea, 250 miles of icy water, separated Germany from England. If the bomber could cross it, the crew might live. If the engines failed over the ocean, they would die within minutes. But first they had to pass the coastal defenses. The German Atlantic Wall stretched along the entire coastline. Radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, observation posts. Every aircraft crossing the coast was watched, tracked, identified. An American bomber flying low and slow toward England would normally be an easy target. Franz Stigler stayed in formation. He flew so close to the bomber that his wingtip nearly touched the B-17's fuselage. If the anti-aircraft gunners fired at the bomber, they would hit him too. It was a silent message. Do not shoot. The gamble worked. The coastal batteries remained silent. Radar operators tracked 2 aircraft flying together and assumed they were friendly. And just like that, ye Olde Pub crossed the German coast and headed out over the gray waters of the North Sea. Franz Stigler had done the impossible. He had escorted an enemy bomber through some of the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. He had saved 9 American lives. But he could not go any farther. His fuel was running low. The bullet lodged in his radiator threatened to overheat the engine. And if he followed the bomber to England, he would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner. He had to turn back. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the cockpit one last time. Charlie Brown looked over through the shattered glass. Their eyes met. 2 young pilots. Enemies. Separated by only a few feet of freezing air. Franz Stigler raised his hand and gave the American pilot a salute. Then he banked his fighter left and disappeared back toward Germany. Charlie Brown watched him vanish into the gray sky. He still did not understand why the German had spared them. He did not know the pilot's name. He did not know the risk the man had taken. All he knew was that someone who should have killed them had chosen not to. But their ordeal was not over. They were still 250 miles from England, and their bomber was barely flying. 3 engines were damaged. 1 engine was dead. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The crew had no oxygen, no heat, no working radio. 1 crewman was dead. 6 more were badly wounded. And the North Sea in December was one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. Charlie Brown pushed the bomber forward over the endless gray water. Below them, waves churned in the freezing wind. The water temperature was just above freezing. If the bomber went down, the crew would survive only a few minutes before hypothermia killed them. The engine struggled. The number 2 engine was completely dead. The number 3 produced only half power. The number 4 surged unpredictably. Only the number 1 engine ran normally. Brown needed 2 engines to maintain altitude. He had 1.5. The airspeed dropped to 140 miles per hour, dangerously close to a stall. Any slower, and the bomber would fall into the sea. Brown pushed the throttles forward, forcing every remaining ounce of power from the damaged engines. The aircraft shuddered, but it stayed in the air. Behind him, the crew fought to survive. Waist gunner Alex Yelisenko had shrapnel buried in his leg. Without medical treatment, he could bleed to death. But the morphine syringes had frozen solid. All his crewmates could do was press bandages against the wound. Ball turret gunner Sam Blackford could no longer feel his feet. The electrical heating wires in his suit had failed. Frostbite was already setting in. Radio operator Richard Pitchout had taken shrapnel in the eye. Nearly blind, he still worked desperately to repair the damaged radio. Every few minutes he tapped out a distress signal. No answer ever came. In the tail section, the body of Hugh Eckenrode remained where he had died. There was no way to move him, no time to mourn him. The living had to survive. Charlie Brown calculated the distance. 250 miles. At 140 miles per hour. Nearly 2 hours of flying. 2 hours in an aircraft that might fall apart at any moment. Mile after mile passed. The engines coughed and sputtered. The bomber groaned under the stress. Brown's hands ached from gripping the controls. His wounded shoulder throbbed with pain, but he refused to let go. 9 lives depended on him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a shape appeared on the horizon. The coast of England. Green fields. Gray cliffs. Home. But Ye Olde Pub was too badly damaged to reach its home base. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The landing gear might not deploy. The flaps might not work. Brown would have to land wherever he could. He spotted RAF seething, an airfield belonging to another bomber group. It was their only chance. Charlie Brown lined up the shattered bomber for landing. The landing gear lowered, barely. The flaps extended only partially. And the crippled B-17 began its final descent. Charlie Brown brought Ye Olde Pub down onto the runway in what could only be described as a controlled crash. The crippled B-17 slammed onto the tarmac. The damaged landing gear tore away instantly. The bomber skidded across the runway in a long shower of sparks before finally grinding to a stop. For a moment, everything was silent. Charlie Brown sat frozen in the cockpit. His hands were still gripping the controls. His entire body was shaking. But he had done it. He had brought his crew home. 8 men climbed out of the bomber alive. 1 man was carried out. The tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode had died during the attack. The bomber itself would never fly again. Ye Olde Pub was eventually shipped back to the United States and sold for scrap metal. But the crew had survived. And that was all that mattered. During the debriefing, Charlie Brown told intelligence officers everything. He described the German fighter that had appeared behind them. He described how the pilot had flown alongside instead of attacking. He described the moment when the German pilot saluted before turning away. The officers listened quietly. Then they gave Brown a direct order. He was never to speak about the incident again. The story was classified. The United States military did not want stories circulating about German pilots showing mercy to American crews. It might create sympathy for the enemy. Brown obeyed. And for decades, he kept the secret. 300 miles away, Franz Stigler landed his Messerschmitt at his airfield near Bremen. He also told no one what had happened. If anyone discovered that he had escorted an enemy bomber to safety instead of destroying it, he would face court-martial. The punishment could be death. So Stigler carried the secret alone. Two young men, enemies in a terrible war, each carrying a story they could never tell, each wondering if the other had survived, each haunted by a moment of humanity in the middle of destruction. The secret would remain hidden for 46 years. The war ended in May 1945. Charlie Brown returned home to West Virginia. He finished college and later rejoined the United States Air Force in 1949. Over the years, he built a successful career in intelligence. Eventually, he retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1972. Later, he moved to Miami, Florida, where he started a company focused on combustion research. Franz Stigler's life took a very different path. Germany lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. During the final months of the war, Stigler had flown the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, the first operational jet in history. But even that technological miracle could not stop Germany's defeat. After the war, Stigler struggled to rebuild his life in a devastated country. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada. He settled in Vancouver, British Columbia, and slowly built a successful business career. Both men carried the memory of December 20th, 1943. Charlie Brown often wondered about the German pilot who had spared his life. Why had he done it? Had he survived the war? But Brown had been ordered to remain silent. And for decades, he obeyed. Franz Stigler also thought about the bomber. He wondered if it had crossed the North Sea. He wondered if the wounded crew had survived. He wondered if saving them had been worth the risk. But he could never ask anyone. The secret remained locked inside him. 43 years passed. Then in 1986, Charlie Brown attended a military aviation event called the Gathering of Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. The event brought together retired pilots from across the United States military. During a discussion, someone asked Brown if he had any memorable combat experiences. For the first time in more than 4 decades, he told the story. The story of the German fighter pilot. The story of the shattered bomber. The story of the salute. The audience sat in stunned silence. When the talk ended, something inside Brown changed. For years he had accepted the mystery. Now he realized he needed answers. He needed to know who that German pilot had been. He needed to thank him. The search began. Brown contacted the U.S. Air Force Archives. No results. He contacted the West German Air Force. No records. He wrote letters to historians across Europe. Nothing. Months turned into years. Every lead failed. The German pilot seemed to have vanished into history. By 1989, Brown was almost ready to give up. Friends told him the pilot was probably dead. Even if he was alive, finding one man among millions of German veterans was nearly impossible. But Brown refused to quit. He wrote one final letter. This time he sent it to a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots called Jägerblatt. In the letter he described the encounter in detail. The date, the location, the type of aircraft, and he asked if anyone knew who the German pilot might have been. The letter was published in 1990. A few weeks later, Charlie Brown received a reply. The envelope had a Canadian postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in careful handwriting. The letter began with 3 simple words. I was the one. Franz Stigler had read the newsletter. He recognized the story immediately. After 46 years of silence, he finally knew the truth. The American bomber had survived. The crew had lived. His decision had not been in vain. Charlie Brown read the letter with tears in his eyes. Every detail matched his memory perfectly. There was no doubt. This was the man who had saved his life. Brown immediately called directory assistants in Vancouver, Canada. He asked if they had a number for Franz Stigler. They did. Brown dialed the number. His hands trembled. An elderly man with a German accent answered the phone. Brown introduced himself. There was a long pause. Then Franz Stigler began to cry. The 2 men spoke for hours. They soon realized something astonishing. For years they had lived less than 200 miles apart. Stigler in Vancouver, Brown in Seattle before later moving to Miami. They had been neighbors without knowing it. They agreed to meet in person later that year. The meeting would take place in a hotel lobby in Florida. 2 former enemies. 2 old men. Both carrying the same secret for nearly half a century. Finally ready to see each other face to face. On a summer day in 1990, Charlie Brown walked into the hotel lobby. He was 67 years old. His hair was gray, but his heart was racing like he was 21 again. Franz Stigler was waiting for him. He was 74 years old. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were the same eyes that had once looked across the shattered cockpit over Germany. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other. 46 years of silence stood between them. Then they walked forward and embraced. A friend recorded the reunion on video. The footage shows two elderly men holding each other tightly, both crying, both shaking. They do not let go for a long time. Charlie Brown brought photographs with him, pictures of his children, pictures of his grandchildren. 3 generations of people who existed because Franz Stigler had chosen not to fire. Stigler looked at the photos with tears in his eyes. He had never received the Knight's Cross. He had never been celebrated for his combat victories. But in that moment, standing in a hotel lobby surrounded by the family he had unknowingly saved, he realized he had received something far greater than any medal. A few months later, Brown invited Stigler to a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group in Massachusetts. Veterans of the unit wanted to meet the German pilot who had saved one of their own. 2 surviving crew members from Ye Olde Pub were there. Ball turret gunner Sam Blackford, radio operator Richard Pitchout. Both had lived long lives after the war. Both had families of their own. They embraced Franz Stigler and thanked him. Because of his decision in 1943, 25 people in that room existed who otherwise would not have been born. The veterans welcomed him as one of their own, and Franz Stigler became an honorary member of the 379th Bomb Group. A German fighter ace was now being welcomed into an American bomber unit. Former enemies, now brothers. And once the story finally became public, it spread quickly. Newspapers picked it up first, then radio, then television. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler found themselves invited to speak at air museums, civic organizations, veterans reunions, and military ceremonies across the United States and Canada. Whenever possible, they traveled together. The American bomber pilot, the German fighter ace, standing side by side before audiences who often left in tears. Veterans in the crowd would openly weep. Young people would wait in line afterward just to shake their hands. Many said the story restored something they thought the world had lost. Proof that even in war, humanity could survive. At one point, Stigler gave Brown a book about German fighter jets. Inside the front cover, he wrote a note. He explained that in 1940, he had lost his only brother to the war. He wrote that on December 20th, 1943, just days before Christmas, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 from destruction. And he wrote that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as that lost brother. At the bottom of the page, he signed it with 2 simple words: your brother. By then, that was no longer a metaphor. They truly had become family. They spoke on the telephone every week. They visited each other's homes. They went fishing together. They spent holidays together. The bond between them was deeper than friendship. It had been forged in a few frozen minutes over Germany and then strengthened across 18 years of shared life. Their story continued traveling farther than either man ever imagined possible. Letters arrived from around the world. People wrote to say it had moved them, that it had restored their faith in human nature, that it proved compassion could survive even in the darkest moments of war. But for Charlie Brown, one thing still remained unfinished. The men of Ye Olde Pub had never received the recognition they deserved for what they endured that day over Bremen. The mission had been buried in classified files for decades. Their suffering, their courage, their survival, all of it had effectively vanished from the official record. Brown decided that had to change. He began writing letters to the United States Air Force. He wanted his crew properly honored. He wanted the world to know what they had survived. Eventually, the Air Force opened an official investigation. Files that had remained sealed for decades were reviewed. Reports were compared. Statements were re-examined. And in 2008, the Air Force reached its conclusion. The findings confirmed everything Charlie Brown had said. The mission to Bremen, the destruction of the bomber, the death of Hugh Eckenrode, the terrible wounds suffered by the crew, the impossible return flight over the North Sea, and the German fighter pilot who had chosen mercy over victory. The Air Force made a decision that stunned military historians. Each surviving crew member of Ye Olde Pub would receive the Silver Star, one of America's highest awards for valor in combat. For the crewmen who had already died, the medals would be awarded posthumously to their families. 9 Silver Stars for 1 bomber crew. It was almost unheard of. But the Air Force was not finished. Charlie Brown himself would receive something even rarer. The Air Force Cross, the second highest award that can be given to a member of the United States Air Force. It is reserved only for extraordinary heroism. No other World War II bomber crew had ever been honored in quite this way. 65 years after their mission, the men of Ye Olde Pub finally received the recognition they had earned. The ceremony was solemn and emotional. Surviving crew members attended with their families. The relatives of dead airmen stepped forward to accept medals on behalf of fathers and grandfathers they had never truly known. Charlie Brown was there. He was 85 years old by then. Frailer now, slower, but unbroken, and standing beside him, just as he had stood beside him for nearly 2 decades, was Franz Stigler. Stigler, too, had already been honored. In 1993, the Combatants for Peace Federation in Europe awarded him the Star of Peace, a recognition given to soldiers who demonstrated exceptional humanity during wartime. He was one of only a few German veterans ever to receive it. But Franz always insisted he did not deserve special praise. He said he had simply done what any honorable man should have done. He had refused to murder defenseless men. He had followed a code older than the war itself, what he called a higher call. As the years passed, the story grew larger than either man. Journalists wrote about it in newspapers and magazines. Documentary filmmakers interviewed them. Military historians cited the incident as one of the most extraordinary examples of mercy in modern aerial warfare. Then, in 2012, author Adam Makos published a book about them. He titled it A Higher Call. The phrase came from Stigler's own explanation of why he had spared the bomber. Makos had spent years interviewing both men, traveling to the locations where the events had taken place, and combing through archives in the United States and Germany. The book became a New York Times bestseller. Readers around the world were captivated by the story of 2 enemies who had become brothers. Veterans said it captured something essential about combat and about the choices men still possess even inside war. In 2014, the Swedish heavy metal band Sabaton released a song inspired by the incident. They called it No Bullets Fly. Suddenly, younger audiences who had never studied the 8th Air Force or the Luftwaffe were learning the names of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler. The story was no longer hidden in veteran circles or history books. It had entered popular memory. In 2019, a surviving B-17 bomber operated by the Erickson Aircraft Collection in Oregon was repainted in the markings of Ye Olde Pub. At air shows across the United States, the restored bomber flew again, carrying the memory of the original crew into the sky. The legacy of December 20th, 1943 had grown far beyond one mission. It had become a symbol, proof that even in a war built on hatred, one human being could still choose mercy. Franz Stigler had given up his chance at the Knight's Cross in order to save 9 enemy lives. In return, he gained something no medal could ever equal: a brother, a family, a legacy that would outlive both of them. But by 2008, both men were old. Stigler was 92. Brown was 87. They had been given 18 years of friendship after their reunion. 18 years of conversations, visits, shared grief, and shared gratitude. And they both knew those years were almost over. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, in Vancouver, British Columbia. He was 92 years old. He had outlived the war, outlived the Luftwaffe, outlived the brother he had lost in 1940. And he died knowing the truth. The B-17 had made it home. The crew had survived. His mercy had mattered. His decision over Germany had echoed across generations. Charlie Brown received the news in Florida. The man who had become his brother was gone. After all the phone calls, the reunions, the ceremonies, the long years of friendship, Franz had finally slipped away. Brown was heartbroken, but he was also at peace. Because Franz had lived long enough to see the consequences of his choice. Long enough to meet the families who existed because he had lifted his finger from the trigger. Long enough to understand that he had not merely saved a bomber. He had saved a future. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown died in Miami. He was 87. The 2 men who had met as enemies over Germany, who had become brothers after 46 years of silence, who had spent the last chapter of their lives telling the world what had happened. Both died in the same year, separated by only 8 months. It was as if one had not wanted to remain behind for very long without the other. Their legacy continued after them. A higher call remained in print, introducing new readers to their story every year. No Bullets Fly carried their names to audiences who had never opened a World War II history book. The restored Ye Olde Pub flew again at air shows, turning memory into something visible and real. But perhaps the deepest legacy was the simplest one. The families. Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner who died over Bremen, had relatives who never stopped asking what had happened to him. For decades, they had only fragments. Only silence. Only loss. Brown and Stigler's story finally gave them answers. The descendants of the surviving crewmen numbered in the dozens. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, teachers, doctors, workers, soldiers, artists. Entire branches of family trees that existed because one German pilot had refused to fire. At reunions, when Franz Stigler met these families, he was often overwhelmed. He had never expected to see the full consequence of his choice laid out before him. A room full of living proof. A crowd of faces. A future that had once hung beneath his gun sight. Stigler once wrote Brown a note that captured everything. He explained that he had lost his only brother in 1940. He wrote that on December 20th, 1943, he had been given the chance to save a B-17 from destruction. And he wrote that Charlie Brown had become as precious to him as that lost brother had been. At the end, he signed it. Your brother, Franz. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is not really a story about war. It is a story about what remains after war. About honor that survives propaganda. About mercy that outlives hatred. About the choices one human being can still make when everything around him says otherwise. Two young men met in the winter sky over Germany in 1943. One had every reason to kill. The other had no reason to hope. And in that moment, something happened that neither nation, neither command structure, and neither war plan could have predicted. Franz Stigler answered a higher call. And Charlie Brown spent the rest of his life grateful that he did.